Hot chocolate, Azure Cosmos Data. Entity framework, our tools. Netforty suite.
Countdown commencing. T-minus 2 minutes.
Jeremy Lickness.
Shiro Chan.
Chris Lanston.
Arthur Vickers.
.NET data. T-minus 1 minute. Thirty seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. We are go for .NET Data Community Standup.
Awesome. Hello, everybody. We are live. We have a great topic today from Chris. But before we start, we will start doing a small little segment, which is EF Core Preview. Currently, we have EF Core 10 Preview 2. And we would definitely like you to try it. There's a few small improvements. You can find all the details on GitHub. The first one, that's not kind of small, is the support for right join that Shai actually implemented a couple of weeks ago. So if you are interested in that, download the preview to try it and give us some feedback. But
I'm guessing maybe most people don't even know that we added left join. This was preview 1, but maybe it's worth mentioning. So there's basically left join and right join in EF Core now, which is a thing that people have been asking for a long time because you needed to do some complex thing in order to express left join. So now you actually just have an operator for left join, but you need to also use the .NET 10 preview 2 or whatever the latest preview in order to get it. So that's like a nice quality of improvement of quality of life.
Yep. With that, let's skip the previews and everything and go into the content. We have Chris here. So Chris, can you introduce yourself?
Hey, yeah, I'm Chris Klug. I work as a software developer / consultant and public speaker at a company called Active Solution in Stockholm.
Awesome.
That's blood type, marriage history. Give us
we can go all the way through if you want. I've got like a 1-hour presentation about my mental health as well, but I think
let's go.
Okay, let me do some clicking here and bring the screen in.
That's interesting. That's not the screen that I'm actually sharing.
Yes.
Let's see if I can get this to give me 1 second. I told it to
problem.
share my screen, but it's sharing something else. Let's try if.
Oh, in the meantime, I can talk about another small thing that's in the previews, just to give Chris a bit of time. if that's
It's
needed.
up now. But
Okay.
you can do that, but I'm up and running now. I don't know why it shared the wrong thing.
I'll say one like 2 sentences. Execute update, which allows you to express an update SQL statement. This is a weird one. People have complained for a bit. If you want to construct a dynamic update, like you want to control a bit more dynamically, like what are you going to update and all that, then that was actually quite difficult in previous versions because execute update accepted an expression tree, and building expression trees is quite hard in general. What we did in 10 was a little change that made it accept just a function that is not an expression tree. So now it's much easier. I'm not going to go into the details. You can go into the release notes. There's a sample there that shows like the previous code, which is ugly and long and error prone, and the new code for basically saying, if something, then also change this into that. And if some other variable, then also change this into this. So basically, you can do these dynamic games now with execute update much more easily in 10 than you could in the past. Shutting up now.
That sounds awesome, though. Okay, yeah, I finally got my screen shared. So that's the answer to who I am, tech dude at Active Solution. You can find me on X, I guess it's called nowadays, and ask me questions if you want to. I'm also on Blue Sky, but I don't even know how to get into Blue Sky at the moment. I've never really moved over. And yeah, the general gist is I work as a developer / consultant, which kind of it affects the way that I look at code a little bit, I think, because it actually means that I need to write code that I drop off to somebody else in the future. So it needs to be readable and understandable in a slightly different way than maybe if you work in-house, I think. Yeah, that's it. Talk, as I said today, is stop using Entity Framework as a DTO provider. And not last time, but when I started doing this talk very, very early on, somebody found me on the internet and found me my GitHub account and actually went into my GitHub, found the demo code that I was going to demonstrate, and then basically wrote a GitHub issue telling me that I'm using Entity Framework wrong. It was actually a much longer thing. It was a long issue and a couple of comments back and forth. And then the last comment from this developer was, you are using Entity Framework wrong, which makes this stream a bit terrifying because I'm now apparently going to do this wrong with the people who built the thing watching me. I want to mention this because I want to mention and get people to understand also that all code is written in a context, right? Everything that we write is based on a context of things that we're working on. And every single piece of code that we're writing is designed with trade-offs. And we need to keep that in mind, and especially when you look at my demos and my examples here, they are written in a context of me trying to demonstrate some things. And I've decided to simplify some things and make some things a bit more complicated than necessary, but it's to demonstrate what you can do. And for me also, I do like object-oriented programming, and I am influenced by DDD, and I really like the idea of having my ORM working with my DDD entities and my DDD domain. So there is going to be a heavy influence of DDD in the way that I do my code, but that's the way it is. My architecture is opinionated, but also everything that I am demoing, even though my architecture is opinionated, the actual tough stuff that I'm doing with EF and the configuration I'm doing works obviously for everything. So you can just ignore my architecture if you don't like it. So basically build it the way that fits you. But I also think that you should be open enough to listen to other people explain how they do it and maybe learn a thing or two about how they do it and bring that into your stuff as well. The talk is now also renamed, so it's not called Stop Using Entity Framework as a DTO Provider. It's now called Stop Using Entity Framework as just a DTO Provider from that comment, because you can use Entity Framework to provide DTOs obviously as well, but I want to take it a bit further. And that obviously leads us into what do I mean with a DTO provider. So to figure that out or to explain it, I went to Wikipedia and I pulled up DTO or data transfer object, and it says, in the field of programming, a data transfer object is an object that carries data between processes. Okay. DTOs are simple objects that should not contain any business logic, but may contain serialization and deserialization mechanisms for transferring data over the wire. This pattern is often incorrectly used outside of remote interfaces. This has triggered a response from its author where he reiterates that the whole purpose of DTOs is to shift data in expensive remote calls. That's a DTO. And when we look at DTOs in C#, for example, they look something like this. So there is no functionality in a DTO. It has no encapsulation whatsoever. It's just a plain old C# object with no logic, no validation, no nothing. It's just a thing to shift data back and forth. And there's nothing wrong with DTOs, but it depends on where you use your DTOs. So if we look at our regular web application here, we've got a network where we've got a database server and a web server. We've got on the web database server, we've got SQL Server and Blackmagic that does stuff in there. And then we have the web application, and inside the web application, there's an application code, and it uses EF Core. And then here, between the processes, we can use a DTO because it makes sense. It's about shifting data between processes. However, in here, it shouldn't be DTOs, because when you start doing DTOs here, you're not shifting data between separate processes. You're actually inside code and you're not shifting data only, which is why I think DTOs don't really fit right there. So I'd rather have EF give me more than just DTOs. Now, when I show this, the obvious question is then, what's wrong with that? And people tend to tell me that they've been using objects like that to access a database for years, right? And what's wrong with it? I will get back to that. But I want to start out with the second part, which is I've been using objects like that to access the database for years. Yes, a lot of us have been writing these very simple POCO objects with no logic and things like that to basically pull information out of the database using Entity Framework. And I think the main reason for us doing that and maybe getting stuck there is that if you go to Microsoft and you look at how to get started with EF Core, you get to this page here and you scroll down and it says start a new project, install Entity Framework Core, create the model, and then go and create your entities. And there we have it. There are those DTOs that I was talking about, stupid objects that shift data between the backend or the database and our application just to get data out. But we can do more. And I will get back into that. But I think this is kind of the main problem that people got stuck into doing DTOs only with Entity Framework, because we as developers, we tend to read the getting started with, and then we stop reading. We don't read the rest of the manual on how to use the technology. We read that, and then we say, we know how to do this. And then that brings us into what's wrong with it. What's wrong with just having stupid objects that you read up from the database with just data in it? And my main concern with doing that is, where do you put your business logic? And whenever I ask this question to somebody who does do that kind of DTO objects to the database, is that I get, well, I use services or commands for that. So I put all of that in different services. So the service will read the DTO, make modifications to it, and persist it again. And my comment to that is, so you mean you spread all your business logic across a bunch of classes and then you call them services? Which means that there's no single point of truth of business logic and no single point of truth when it comes to validation and all of that stuff. It's all spread out in a bunch of different services that may or may not you work with only that specific entity type. There's also the very simple, where do you put the data validation? So if you just have get set and they're both public and there's nothing in there to validate it, where do you put it? And then obviously the response is, hey, I put that in my services and my commands again. And I keep coming back to, so you spread it out across a bunch of classes. But here I sometimes get a response back, somebody going, no, of course not. I have a validator class that my service and my commands use. So I have a entity validator that I can pass in my entities to and validate that they're valid before I persist them. And that's a good idea. The only problem with that is that you kind of end up forcing the services and commands to remember to call it as well. So if somebody new comes into your project, a new developer builds a new service and don't know that there is a validator class that knows how to validate first names and last names and email addresses and all of that stuff, then all of a sudden you have duplicate validation or you have no validation in that service. You're basically forcing different developers to remember to do things for it to be done. And then there's the slightly better response, or very much better response in my opinion, which is that's why we have setters. Every property in an object-oriented language, more or less, has the ability to have gets and sets. And in your setter, you can go ahead and add your validation there, which is nice because you are actually connecting your validation logic to the entity and your business logic. So you have data and logic in the same place, which is much easier to understand. So that whenever somebody comes and says, hey, what are the rules around setting the name for our user? You open the user class, you look at the name property, and you get, oh, here are the validation rules that are specific for that property as such. But one thing to remember that there are some potential problems with using setters. It's totally fine to add validation logic in your setters. And as I said, I enjoy that, and I think it's a great way of doing it. And it also allows you to validate not just one property at a time. It actually allows you to validate that that property works together with other properties in the current context and things like that. But we as developers, or at least most developers I know, we are really good at putting try-catch around calling methods. We are not that great at putting try-catch around setters. We just assume that when you set a property, you just set it, and that's fine because we're used to these stupid DTOs. But once you start throwing validation exceptions in your setters, you also need to teach the people using your class that, hey, you need to potentially have try-catch around setting these values as well because, well, there could be issues. Now, to demonstrate this and show how I solve it and how I work with it, I created a very simple example domain. And now I want you to understand that it is very simple, it is stupid, and there are gaps in it, definitely. But it's also really hard to build a micro domain that is complicated enough for me to show off what I want to show off, but small enough and simple enough to fit into one slide like this one does. So it's a made up domain that I've come up with. So it's a kind of like a DMV kind of thing where you have vehicles and you have owners who own vehicles, and then owners or person has addresses, and there are two different types of addresses. There are delivery address and invoice address. And when you start looking at this, and you've got the many-to-many relationship between owner and person, or owner and vehicle, and you have a one-to-many with person and address, and you sit down and you do that in SQL Server or your database, you end up with a schema that looks something like this. There's nothing interesting here more than potentially the fact that vehicle owners also has a from and to, so we have dates in the relationship, and if the to is null, it means that you're the current owner because you haven't ended your ownership of that vehicle. And the other potentially interesting part is in the addresses table, we have first of all, we have a type. So that's the thing that defines if it's an invoice or a delivery address. And then there's also an is current that keeps track of what's the current invoice and delivery address for a specific person. Now, the easiest way to do this is that simple DTO kind of way and services. And if we just jump across, let's see if I can jump over to Visual Studio. There we have it. So I've created a couple of examples here, but first of all, I have this DTO role. I just call it role because it's a very, very simple thing. And here we can see how it works when you do just simple DTOs. I have a person service and I have a vehicle service. And if we look into the vehicle service, it basically has a bunch of methods like add vehicle, get vehicle by VIN, get vehicle by ID, get current owner by VIN, set current owner. And each one of these has access to a DB context. It does some includes to figure out that to be able to get the owner, I need to include the owner as well. And then because of an owner, I need to include a person as well because the owner is a combination of owner and person. And then I have some null checks. Then I check if there is a current owner, otherwise I get an exception. Then I need to go and find the people in here. So it's fairly easy code to read, but when we get into writing things, so if we do, for example, actually that was set current owner. So get current owner. Set current owner has some interesting little details in here, for example. Now, first of all, knowing that when you end an ownership, or you need to look at the current owner, and then you have to set the to today's date to make it not a current owner anymore because the ownership has been removed. And then you need to add a new person in here, a vehicle owner, and you need to add that to the DB context. And if we go in and look at something like, for example, the person service, it gets even muddier because in here, in this set person's address, for example, we have some validation in here. We're not doing a lot of validation, but there is some validation in here, checking for null values or empty values for these 3 inputs here. Then we need to pull up some data. We need to check, so there's a business requirement in here as well that says that a person, if it has an existing address, that needs to be turned off. But we also need to make sure that once we've added our new address, we want to make sure that we only persist the last 3 known addresses, because we don't want to keep records of every single database forever, or address forever in the database. So if there's more than 3, we need to remove the old ones and so on. So it becomes this intermingled mess of validation logic and business logic, like the is current, the number of addresses that need to be saved. And all of this business logic, even if it is very simple in this case, is now spread out across the vehicle service, across the person service, across different areas, across different property or different methods. So in here, there's some address validation stuff, and then in the
Chris, I will jump into, maybe can you zoom in a little bit on the code?
Oh, absolutely. Sorry, was it that small? Let's try. Is that bigger?
That's definitely
It is.
better.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Thank you for that. Yeah, so what I basically want to get at is that once you start doing that simple DTO thing, it's very easy to get started. It's very easy to ask your questions, because Entity Framework just allows us to do that in a very easy way. But it also means that we are messing with having validation and business rules and everything in one place, in multiple places in different services, which I just don't like. Now, if we want to make it a little bit cleaner, is that possible? Can we make it a bit more object-oriented? Because somewhere along the way, it seems like we forgot about object-orienting, right? A big part of building object-oriented code and having objects is the fact that we can combine data and functionality into one object and make that the thing that we work with the thing that encapsulates everything and hides all the inner workings of it. And this doesn't. This spreads it out across everywhere. And we can make this a bit more object-oriented. I have done this before I found out that there's probably a better way to do it. But we can make this kind of code. If you have a lot of this code already and you don't want to rewrite the whole thing, you can make these DTOs a bit more OOPy. I'm still trying to make OOPy a thing. I don't think it's going to take off, but I like the word OOPy. It's a bit more object-oriented, right? So what would it look like if we want to take those DTOs and make them a bit more object-oriented, a bit more DDD entity-like? Well, it will look like something like this, right? So we still have that vehicle DTO class, for example, that has the data that comes in and out of the database, the thing that we've mapped through Entity Framework. But then we wrap that whole thing in another object. In this case, I'm calling that object a vehicle DTO because it is literally a DTO. And then I wrap that in a vehicle class, and then I put my logic in the vehicle class, so my business logic. So I have a set owner method on my vehicle. I have a static create method to create a vehicle that's fully started up, set up. And when we get down to the properties, it still exposes the VIN, for example, that is from the vehicle. It still exposes the current owner and the previous owner. But instead of forcing the person looking for the current owner having to go through the owners list and figuring out which owner is the one that doesn't have a property set and such things, I can wrap that into my vehicle class. So I can call up a vehicle and then say .current owner or .get previous owners or .previous owners to get the previous ones. And I get all my validation logic in here, and I get all my business logic in one class by wrapping my DTO. So if we look at what that would look like in my very simple domain, it ends up with being a class like, let's see, I've got my entities up here. So if we look at, for example, the vehicle class, you can see here that I have a vehicle, and in the private constructor, it takes in a models vehicle, which is my DTO, and just sets that as a vehicle up here. And then for set owner, all of the business logic around my owner's collection of being able to end the ownership and set the new owner and all of that stuff is in that one method. And for the current owners, the logic around how to find that is in here. Now, the only thing that kind of doesn't really work well for me in here is that we are wrapping this. So in this case, it's not a problem because I only have one simple property here called VIN. But if you're doing a bigger object that has 10, 15, 20, whatever properties on it, and it's getting bigger, all of this having to basically pass through and write your properties once in the DTO and once in my actual entity is just annoying. It becomes a chore, and the bigger your object is, the more complex it becomes. But I still like the fact that we have, so here's my regular expressions for my VIN numbers. When you set the VIN, it gets checked, and all of the business logic is in one place. And when we use this, if we look at the vehicle service, it becomes really nice. So set current owner now becomes this. I call get vehicle or context.vehicle with VIN, which is just an extension method. So it's an extension method that allows me to do a query against an entity framework DB context in a nice way. Then I just need to verify, did I get something from the database? Yes, no. What is the new owner that I want to use? And then I have a try catch around a vehicle set owner and save changes as sync. Very, very nice and succinct, and there's nothing complicated in here, but I still have all the same logic, all the same validation, but the consumer of my class is much more simpler and doesn't need to know all of the stuff it needed previously to be able to do the work it does. So that's a nicer way, right? It does give us a bit more object-oriented. It gives us a bit more of a DDD entity to work with. But I would still ask the question, why do it like this? Unless you already have a bunch of DTOs that you don't want to remap, I don't see the reason for working with it like this. And the reason I have this question, it might seem stupid, but I've seen a lot of people wanting to work like this because it's nice and simple to get entity framework to map your simple DTOs. They do help us a lot with those simple things. But entity framework is an ORM, right? And what is an ORM? Well, I went online to find a definition of an ORM because I didn't want to write my own, and I found this place here. And it says, an ORM, or object relational mapper, is a piece of software designed to translate between the data representations used by databases and those used in object-oriented programming. Now, I really like this part here. Designed to translate between the data representations used by databases and those used in object-oriented programming. So what we're saying is we can actually map it to the objects that we want. Yes. An ORM can do so much more than just map one-to-one, basically one table to one class in C#, and you're having to replicate your database structure and your database layout in classes in C#. We can go so much further with all the power that we're getting out of Entity Framework, and I really think we should. So if we look at the domain that I have, that's exactly the same slide that I had before. We kind of understand how that works. It's not a very complex domain. However, I also realized that because we have that little connector in the middle that says owner/person, I see those as two different things, right? So it's still the same class. The same table in the database. It's the people table. But they are two different things in my domain. So domain-wise, if I would pull this a bit more towards domain-driven design, I would probably do it as two different bounded contexts or two different subdomains. One which is vehicle management and one which is people management, where vehicle management has owners and vehicles, but that's it. We only want to know what vehicles are available and who owns them. Whereas in the people management side, we want to know that a person has invoice addresses and delivery addresses and all of that stuff. But we're working in those two separately. We don't want to go in and modify a user's vehicle at the same time as we update the invoice address. That's not the way a system normally works. So I want to split it. So we end up splitting it into 2 different sets of entities. But in my case, I am going to map them towards the same database. And that might not be optimal. I might admit that. You might want to have 2 databases, but say that we are mapping it all to one big database, which I think is a valid choice for something as simple as this. We end up having to make a choice between table splitting or multiple DB contexts. Now, multiple DB contexts are nice because they are very, very distinct. You know that in subdomain A, you have a DB context that has mapped and has only the entities that you want to work with in that subdomain. And in subdomain B, you have a separate DB context with only the things you need in that bounded or that subdomain. The problem with that is that you end up with 2 DB contexts or multiple DB contexts, which means that you cannot do migrations in a nice way, because your migrations will only migrate 1 DB context at a time, which means that you can't use the tooling to get migrations if you want to do that. It gets complicated writing your migrations because you can't connect a migration to a specific DB context because they're still using the same database. So the option that might be better is using table splitting, which allows you to connect basically the same type of entity to multiple versions of an entity, to the same table in the database. The only thing to remember when you do this, in my opinion, is that if you map multiple entities to the same table in the database, make sure that one entity owns each column. So you can have different entities can own different columns in that database, but don't let multiple entities write to that table. Let one of them be like the master of the data that makes sure that it's correct. That's just a tip because it causes some problems if you don't. Now, the added bonus with doing these bounded contexts is that you also end up with probably a bit of an aggregate root that they call it in DDD, which is where you read up a smaller part of the database and not everything is connected. You don't have to build this humongous model where everything is interconnected and then have lazy loading that allows you to pull up the entire database if you want to. Instead, you can actually disable lazy loading and eager load everything that you need for an entity, because you're probably going to have smaller clusters of entities that are good enough or small enough for you to read straight up and eager load. So I have a demo of showing how we could map my very simple domain into more of a DDD style kind of application. So I've got up here in my domain. If we go into the domain class here, we can see that there are 2 different class folders, one for people management and one for vehicle management. And we have a little infrastructure thing, which is useless. It's just a service result from my service, nothing interested in there. I have a demo DB context. It's literally a completely empty DB context. It has nothing in there. And inside of the different domains or subdomains, we have a service, which is identical to the services in my other projects, but they're not implemented. And I have a little DTO class because all my services work with entities inside of the actual service, but it always returns a DTO that is ready to be sent over the wire to the person consuming my service. I don't want to expose my actual entities to anything outside my service. I just want to have DTOs. So DTOs are still there, but they're not the thing that I work with. They are the thing that I return from my services so that they can be sent over the wire from your API or whatever. So that's kind of what I've got in here. Nothing very complicated so far. And the first thing I need some entities, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a class in here. I'm going to call it vehicle. And I'm going to cheat a bit. So I have some snippets in here. So I have a vehicle. A vehicle has a list of owners. Look at that, it being private. Encapsulation is a tenet of object-oriented programming. So we put that as a private list of owners. We have a VIN in here, and we have this logic to figure out which is the current owner and what previous owners have been there using some link queries on my owners list. Then I have a funky little thing here called a value object from domain-driven design. So I have a value object called VIN. And the reason that I want to have vin as a value object instead of just using vin as a string is that a vin actually has a predefined format. It is 17 characters based on that regular expression. And by using a value object instead of passing around the string, I know that whenever I get a vin, it is a valid vin, because there's no way, well, you can create a vin and make it invalid, but generally we should use vin.create or vin.tryCreate. And then whenever you do any of those two things, it will actually check that the value you're using is valid according to the regular expression. So whenever you get a vin, you can always assume that the vin is valid because it is a vin. That's the way it is. And you can't pass in any old string. So I like having value objects. So I'm moving that out of there. I have an owner class. Now the owner class is going to be basically a combination of my connection table that has the from and to, as well as the first name, last name, and ID of my actual user or the person in the system. And funky enough, I actually think there's a merge conflict here, but we'll see if that causes problems later on. I updated some things. The name thing here down here might cause problems, but let's look at that if it causes problems. Just going to move that out. I don't know why that isn't being used properly. I'm just moving that as well. I wanted to use a value object in there as well. Okay, so we now have these different entities. We need to have a database for this, and I'm not sure that the people on this call from the EF team likes this, but I actually write my migrations manually, which is apparently not fully supported, but I'm going to do it like that anyway. So I'm going to add a migrations folder, and inside my migrations folder, I'm going to add a class. I'm going to call it initial migration. I'm going to replace this piece of code there with something that looks like this. I'm just going to say initial migration to mark it as a migration. I'm going to migrate the demo context like that. I think the migrations are simple enough to write on my own that I actually enjoy just writing them and having full control of the way that they work. So I'm going to say, nope, we want to have O2. That's the one. I'm going to go ahead and create a table in here called vehicles. It only has a VIN and an ID. That's it. I'm going to go and create a people table that contains all the people, which is basically just an ID, first name, last name, and a little primary key. I'm going to add a table called vehicle owners, which is that connection table between the vehicle, the person, and then have a from and to date time stamp. And it then has primary key and 2 foreign keys. And then I'm just adding 2 indexes in here because I know that I will be querying based on some things that makes it better to have those indexes, I believe. And now for the down, honestly, I almost never implement down because I don't believe in rolling back. When we deploy with pipelines, if we make a mistake, we prefer adding another migration and rolling forward and doing that. So down is not implemented in most of my projects in a proper way, but I'm going to put it in here for the sake of having it here. Now, there is a little problem here, and this is where sometimes we do have to bow to the will of Entity Framework to a certain degree. And the owner class is one of those scenarios that where the easiest way to solve this is just to bow to the way that Entity Framework wants us to do it. And that's the fact that there is a person table, right? So the owner class here is actually a combination of the connection and the actual person object. And I do believe that there are mapping ways to solve this in different ways, but the easiest way to do it is to simply introduce a person class here. And I'm going to move that out as well. So it's out of here. And then I'm going to change my owner class here a little bit. And I'm going to have a private field here called person. And then I'm going to do kind of the same thing I showed with the DTO objects. I'm going to wrap my person object as a private field. And then when we read the ID and the name, we read it out of the person. And then the to and the from will be mapped to the same table that we have on our own. Now, Once again, I believe this might be possible to map straight up in a nicer way, but this works perfectly fine. And also, I really don't care about this thing in here, which is a bit annoying. What I care about is that the person using the owner class, the consumer of my class, never sees that. It's out of the way and it just works, right? And it works the way that we expect it to. So I don't mind fudging a little bit to make it work, as long as the end result is nice and easy to work with.
I just note it is in the factory method there, right? Like the consumer does when they create an owner, they need to pass a person, right?
Yes. So when they create an owner, we're gonna.
Oh, I mean, I don't
show you, but yeah, when we do the add owner, you actually pass in a person, and then the vehicle or the class where you do add owner, you pass in a person as the new owner, and then it creates an owner class for me based on that person. So you never really see that conversion is being hidden, but yes, there is a you pass in person here and owner, you get an owner back. So it's basically you create an owner and then it figures everything out.
Okay.
So it should be fairly easy to use. Nice, and I'm going to show you how it's being used when we get to that. Now, this last thing to do is obviously map this into Entity Framework, and this is the part that I actually enjoy a lot. There's so much stuff you can do in here, and I learn new things all the time. I'm just going to do a very simple mapping of the vehicle here to the vehicles table. I'm putting in a property called ID. Now, this is something that I realize that most people or a lot of people don't really know about. It's the shadow property thing, where if we go and look at vehicle doesn't actually have an ID property at all. But by using this generic version of property of type int and then a string, Entity Framework actually manages that property under the hood for us. So we can query it and we can use it for relationships and things like that, but it doesn't have to be a part of our class, which I really like because it takes away those IDs from a lot of classes that we really don't want to use. Then
I'll note if it's okay to jump in and interrupt just for fun. I mean, it's very fascinating and you're delivering like a really cool presentation. So I kind of just didn't want to. Yeah, this thing with shadow properties is indeed a thing that people don't use so much and many people don't know about. And indeed, like one of the cases, like one of the even more prominent cases where people kind of use it, but they don't know they're using it is foreign keys. So many times people will have like a blog and they have a post and the post references the blog back, but the post doesn't actually have a blog ID on it. Like people don't actually have an int blog ID, and they kind of never thought about it. But of course, somewhere it has to be there, right? Because in the database you do have the foreign key somewhere. So we actually set up a foreign key. It's a case where we set up where we have a convention that sets up a foreign key for you as a shadow property. But on the other hand, I will just say this. I get the desire to not pollute your business model with, of course, with stuff like an ID, which is completely, I'm not pushing back in any way. It's also important for people to realize what's the downside of that. And one of the downsides is when you have a shadow property, it still has to be somewhere, right? Like somebody needs to store it somewhere. And the place where that's stored is inside the EF change tracker, right? So when you're loading a thing, like in this case, what is it, a vehicle, sorry, then inside EF's belly is this change tracker, which tracks this vehicle, and it is the one that has the ID. And what that very, very specifically means is that if you now want to, for example, serialize that to JSON to send to some client, to some, I don't know, web client, and then receive that thing back for editing, you have to be extra careful to make sure where do you get that ID in order to shove it into the JSON, right? It's not on your, you can't just serialize that DTO anymore to put like or into a DTO, right? So you have to be extra careful with what we call disconnected scenarios, because that ID will disappear the moment you dispose or get rid of that context. Your ID is gone and you've forgotten it. So there is that idea that you sometimes do want to persist, I'm using that word, the ID inside your actual .NET type, because it moves around with that type and it gets serialized with that type and so on. That's kind of like the counter thing, which again, it's all a matter of, all of these things are questions of taste and style, and everything is legitimate. I'm just kind of giving the other viewpoint on this. Yeah,
it's a very nice segue to something that I'm going to be showing on later on, because I actually one of my other classes, I do it as a private field instead, because it allows me to expose it in a way. I'm not going to show you that at the end of the presentation. The reason that I don't want to have the ID specifically on vehicle is that nobody ever references a vehicle. It has a natural identifier, which is the VIN. So I assume that the client would always use the VIN as the identifier for my
So
API.
why have an ID at all in that? That's like the typical database modeling kind of discussion, right?
I know, but also the only thing that I have, I need to be able to do relationships between the vehicle and the person, and I didn't expect a 17-character string to be a very good primary key, right?
I see.
So
so it's a performance consideration, basically.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a performance consideration, because I'm not that good at databases that I would actually. It's just convention. I always do ints or GUIDs for my keys, and in this case, the int was just a nice way to do it, and it allows me to show this and the other thing that you talked about hiding the ID as well, but having it for the serialization.
Yeah.
So I'll get back to it, but it's a very good comment.
Sure, no problem. And one other point that I just want to make completely sure, you can have the best of both worlds by having a private field, for example, that's simply not exposed publicly on your CLR type that contains the ID, which allows both the entity to carry the ID around and also not expose it to your user. So there's all kinds of solutions depending where you want to go with this. And now I'll shut up and let you go on.
I'm going to come back to that specific scenario later on in the talk.
Awesome.
But what is kind of cool is that I just love the fact that the shadow properties, if you just do this, it looks at your class, and if there is a property with that ID, it uses the property. If there is not a property, it looks to see if there's a field, so it works to use this for private fields as well. Or if there's no field or property with that name, then it uses a shadow property. So it's kind of nice, but I also have made it a convention that I use capital first letters, so I use Pascal casing for shadow properties, and I use camel casing for private fields. So I can look into my mapping to see whether or not I'm mapping a private field or if I'm mapping a shadow property from the code that I'm doing. But that's just me. Then I map my owners, my private list here. So here I'm using the has generic of owner, mapping it towards the private field. And then because I know that I always want to have a fully fledged, in this case, kind of like a full object to work with that is always populated as my aggregate root that I work with, I do add auto include to pretty much everything I do. So I don't have to, every time I do a query for a vehicle, I don't have to do .include, blah, blah, blah. I always auto include everything for me.
May I ask a question? I'm the annoying crowd that you usually don't get in your real presentation. I'm genuinely asking. I'm always interested in having an answer to this. So you're using auto include, which is something that few people know. What people usually do know and use for this kind of thing is owned entities. And I'm kind of just curious if there's a specific reason. I'm not criticizing, or I'm actually asking, like, if there's a specific reason you prefer auto include rather than owned. Just saying that the owners is owned, basically.
This is just something that I've been using. Owned entities might be just as well. It would have worked probably.
No problem. Okay, no problem at all.
I might have to look into that and see if I get an opinion and can answer you at some point.
I was curious, just in case. No problem.
Okay. Yep. And then finally, I ignored the two calculated properties that's being done inside. Then we can map the owner class, which is that combination of from the vehicle owners table. I have a shadow property called vehicle ID. I map that private field, the person, and I auto include my person, and I ignore the ID and name. Now, one thing I forgot to do up here, because I was thinking about something else, is here. This is my value object, right? An entity framework has no idea what a VIN is, so it has no way for me to actually work with a VIN, because entity framework, we're just going to say, hi, I have no idea what a VIN is. But there is this cool has conversion that I really like, because it allows me to say, if I get a VIN and I want to convert it to something that can be used by the database, you do VIN.value. And if you get a string from the database and you want to convert it into a VIN, you call VIN.create. And now I can query VIN using an actual VIN object instead of having to convert it to a string and all that stuff. So my value properties value objects are kept intact throughout the way, and Entity Framework fixes that for me.
I'm going to have to say just one comment about this. If you can scroll up, like value converters are absolutely awesome. Everybody uses them all the time. So it is a super cool Swiss knife that EF Core manages for you. And I'm not at all saying anything against it, but there is one thing to be said against it, unfortunately. And that's the thing. Like if you're people use, by the way, value conversions for many reasons. This one is the reason of I have my own type, which I want to, basically a wrapper type. It's indeed a very kind of encapsulation approach, and we see this a lot with DDD. What you lose with this is the ability to use that object inside queries. So as long as all you're doing is basically reading and writing that string, a VIN is a string at the end of the day with some validation around it and all that. As long as you're reading and this basically just serializing and deserializing it from the database, that's completely fine. That's what value converters do very well. But the moment you want to start doing something like where the VIN starts with something, which makes no sense, I think, with vehicles, like nobody wants to do that kind of query, right? But I don't know, maybe there's VINs with varying lengths, I'm not sure, I don't know, and you want to get only those with a certain length, or you want basically this kind of thing. The moment it's more than just a blob, an opaque thing, which VINs are, but the moment it's a bit more than that, and you want to start doing stuff like where the length is this, or where the third character, and then you know, basically link querying, then this whole thing falls down, unfortunately, because it's really it's much too complicated a problem now to start thinking about how we're going to translate you have your type there, right? It has functions on it, maybe that you've done, I don't know. Now, how do you start expressing what those functions should start translating in? How do those translate to SQL or whatever? This is really, really a complex problem, and it would especially require users like you would have to do a huge amount of work just to specify the mappings between everything here. It's really a very complicated problem, unfortunately. So I'm just very, very, I'm kind of always cautious about this. Like people go very quickly into value converters without realizing that they lose queryability once they do that. So I'm kind of making that point here.
I completely understand that point. And like I would only, my main usage of it is value objects, where it's basically just wrapping a thing, and I never want to query.
Yeah,
it doesn't make sense. It's
exactly.
Like
so that's perfect. Exactly. I guess like my more high level kind of message here to connect my two comments together, like these things that you're showing are very good and they go in a certain direction, but it's also important for people to understand most of these things also have a price. So you get something like with the shadow property, you get something, but you lose something, the ability to carry the idea around it. Here you get something, the encapsulation, but you lose the queryability. So I just want to make sure that people realize that when they make these decisions, it's important to be fully aware of what you get, but also of what you lose, and not like we sometimes see somebody charging in and doing a lot of patterns and wrappings and things and so on, and then suddenly we get an issue. Oh wait, I can't query, I can't do this, I can't do that. Can you please add all these features which I just wasn't aware? And unfortunately, it's not always possible it's just not solvable problems in many cases. So not criticizing in any way. It's really different paths that you can take, and each one of them has a trade-off basically.
So I could go and say then on the other hand, but I can still write my own SQL query manually and query inside of this thing here, and then return and have Entity Framework map my returned values into objects. Sorry, I'm not going to go down there, but I thought I'd just mention it.
Yeah, there's all kinds of workarounds that you can make, and
I said at the beginning of the talk, there is context around everything, and everything is a trade-off.
Exactly. The question, like because now we're talking a little bit of philosophy. Sometimes I see people, they wanted to have a very simple thing in the end. Like all they wanted is to encapsulate their thing, and they ended up in an extremely convoluted thing because, you know, they started, you know, going in a design where they absolutely want to keep the original thing, but since it's not supported, they end up in a place that's horribly complicated and really unmanageable. And then is that the correct thing? Sometimes you get so hung up on, I see users getting so hung up on a principle of encapsulation or of sometimes it becomes a bit of a cargo code. That's all kind of what I'm trying to say. And you pay so much for the principle, which if you relax the principle, you would basically have such an incredibly more simple you know, program. And then are you making the right trade-off there? That's basically my point.
And I completely agree. Okay, sorry. I'm going to run out of time. I'm just going to say that we're going to go over, but that's just the way it works.
As always here in this thing.
Yeah, you can also do this generically, by the way. I want to mention that. So you can actually register them so they don't have to be inline things. But I kept it very, very simple here. Then we map the person, and finally we map. Sorry, that was the last thing I wanted to map. Like that. Sorry. Cool. So now I've mapped my entities towards my database. We can go over to my vehicle service and actually start implementing things. And I'm going to start out by implementing get vehicle by VIN for different reasons. And the implementation for that is going to be something like this, right? And this is what I like about value objects as well, is I get a string in because nobody outside of my system knows what a VIN is, but they're going to pass in a string. Then I just do VIN try create, and then if that fails, I can return an invalid VIN exception because I know that it wasn't a valid VIN. Then I need to get a vehicle from the database, and here are multiple different ways of doing it. We can do repositories, we can do DB context straight in here and everything. I'm going to keep it very, very simple in this case. I'm not sure that this is a great way to do it if you're going to go with anything bigger or more advanced. It also makes it a bit hard to mock if you ever want to do testing and things like that. But I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to accept my DB context into my constructor. And then inside of my, let's see where I want to do this. I want to add a folder called data in here. I'm going to add a new class in here. I'm going to call that demo context extensions. And I'm going to make it look like this. So it's basically just an extensions class, a static class that extends the demo context with a vehicle with VIN. It takes a VIN, it has the tracking ability here. As no tracking is probably the wrong way around. It feels like a double negative, but yeah, you can turn off tracking because if you're only going to return it back to the client, you don't need the tracking turned on, so you can just do as no tracking. And then you can see here, first to default async, and I actually pass in a VIN here. With that, the context available, I can then go back in here and we can simply say await context.vehicle with VIN, and that's not quite what I want. I want to do this. And you're going to say, why are you doing an exclamation mark there? Well, it's nullable, right? And this thing comes out as nullable, but I do know that it is set because of up here I do try create, so I add an exclamation mark to make it tell it that it's valid. And then once I've got my vehicle here, I need to return it back, and I want to return DTOs. Like you see here, I return a vehicle DTO. And the way that you can fix this quickly, in my case, is I'm going to do a DTO extensions class. I'm going to make that look like this. So it's once again a static class that has two model for vehicle and for owner, which allows me to basically take a vehicle, call toModel, and get a vehicle DTO back, and it pulls out the data that I need and puts it into the vehicle of DTO class. So we can do vehicle.toModel like that to create it to DTO. Now I do want to mention that I am a proponent, and I really like the idea of CQRS, where you have a separate model for querying that is optimized for querying and doesn't come with as much overhead and joins and all of that stuff. And then you maybe use something like what I'm building here for your right part of the CQRS or the commanding side of it. But I wanted to keep it all in one place. So I'm just going to do a very simple toModel here. It works. It's nothing complicated. Get vehicle by ID. Well, that's another thing that we can implement. It looks very similar. It's yeah, that was it. Sorry, that was what I wanted. Now I need to add one of these get vehicle by ID. And as I said, a problem with this is that, let's see, I want to go in here. Vehicle with ID is a bit complicated because I told you that I wanted to hide the ID because I didn't want to have that anywhere. But say that my system has a very old integration where they actually care about ID. So I still need to query based on the ID, but the vehicle obviously doesn't have an ID because it's a shadow property. That is still queryable. And this is another one of those that a lot of people don't seem to know about, is that you can actually query like this. And you tell ef.property of type int, you pass in the object that you want to query on, and you give it a string version of what you want to query on, which in this case is a shadow property called ID, which, by the way, is case sensitive. And then I can compare that to ID. So this allows me, this ef.property allows me to query basically anything that is in the model that I've designed. So I can query for shadow properties and private fields and everything like that by using EF property, which is quite nice. So that gives us
the other. I'll just note, like continuing on this theme of shadow properties. Of course, the disadvantage there is in when you're querying is that you have to use strings to basically specify the name, and so it can get out of sync if you ever modify the name of your property and so on. So now, yeah, you would want to use a name of, but usually the whole point is that you don't want to have a property there, right? Yeah. But so then some people end up putting the names of shadow properties as string constants in some place, just so that they can reference it. Like there's all kinds of themes around this sort of thing, but just mentioning it.
Good point. Get current owner. So get current owner is interesting because the default implementation that you would probably run to when you're getting the current owner would be check the VIN, get the vehicle by VIN, check if there is a current owner, and then return the current owner.toModel, which is a decent way of doing it. And it allows me to tell you it's a vehicle not found or an owner not found. But it also potentially pulls up other things. If I had auto include on other properties, I might pull up more than I need. Honestly, in this case, I'm pulling up the vehicle object when all I really need is the actual owner object. We can do that a bit better as well. We could do something like this, where we go and say, hey, DB context, can you get me a set of vehicle? And I want to have where the VIN is this. And then I want to use the EF property to query my private field of iCollection owner, and then ask for the first owner where the to field is null. Now, this is nice because it returns the first owner in my, or the owner of the current vehicle, and it only returns that. Now, the downside is that it will also return null if the VIN isn't there. So it will give me a null value whether or not the VIN is incorrect or there is no owner on that car, which isn't quite what I want. I want to be able to tell the user what was wrong. So we can take that one step further and say, hey, give me a set of vehicle where the VIN is this, and then do this subquery thing in here where we say, hey, can you read out the VIN for that specific vehicle as well as the current owner? Which then, if we look at the vehicle projection here, returns an object that has owner and VIN on it, which only reads the things that I really need from the database. And then if there is nothing, if I don't get a vehicle projection, then the VIN was wrong. If I don't get an owner, then I know that there is a car with that VIN, but there's no owner for it at the moment, and I can then return the result back. So we can definitely go in and do these more performant queries whenever we need to, but I still tend to go with the simpler queries to begin with, and then if we specifically need it for performance reasons, I would go ahead and do it a bit more complex. Let's just see so I'm not missing out here. I'm going to go up and do the add vehicle thing, which is something that looks like this. Once again, try create VIN, get the vehicle with VIN, throw an exception if it doesn't exist. Now I need to get hold of a person. So I'm just going to do an extension method on my demo on this thing here. Once again, just get a set of person and the ask no tracking thing here that I might need in the future. And then we get with person with ID. If there's no such person, then I throw an exception, and then I go in and I tell it, hey, can you go and create a vehicle for me? So I use this static create method that I'm going to create here. And as we discussed earlier, I pass in a person here because a person is the thing that owns a vehicle. But when I create a vehicle and I pass in the person owner, it becomes an owner of that vehicle. So I still keep that idea of a person and an owner and the names that you would expect in that domain in a proper way. Then I add it to the DB context and I save the changes and I return the results. And finally, the last one is set current owner, which once again, check the VIN, get the vehicle, get the new owner. Then we need on the vehicle to create a set owner object or method. So if we go over to vehicle, once again, we need something like this. We pass in a person, which is supposed to be the new owner, and then the business logic is in here. If there is a current owner and the current owner is the one that I'm trying to set it to now, then I'm trying to basically set the same owner, which is wrong. Otherwise, I tell the current owner to end its ownership, and then I create a new owner and I add it to the owners. And the last thing I need to do is I need to create a method called end ownership, so that anybody who wants to end the ownership doesn't need to know that ending an ownership means setting a weird property somewhere that does the work for us. So that's kind of nice. It now means that my vehicle service, when you go in and read, you can see there's not a bunch of validation stuff in here. It's all about throwing exceptions if there is something missing. And then all of the business logic is in my actual entities the way that I want it to. Now, the second part of this is the people management. And there's going to be a lot of repetition, but I wanted to show you a little bit more in here. And the only thing that's really interesting in here is the address class. The address class is an abstract base class called address, and then which has all the implementation on it. And then I have two different classes in here, delivery address and invoice address, that inherit from address, which in my person object allows me to set a delivery address, set an invoice address, which are stored in a collection of addresses. But then when I ask for delivery addresses and delivery address and invoice address, I can actually say, hey, get me addresses of this type. So I do get typing in here. Yes?
If I may interject, this is something I noticed before. Like this is actually the only thing I don't like in your entire presentation. The one thing I don't like here is the fact that there's synchronous IO. So basically, I get what's happening. Like basically, you're having these properties like delivery address, and because they're properties can't be asynchronous, right? So then what you're doing, this first or default, is basically executing a synchronous query to the database.
So this is going to be in memory.
Or have you? I think I saw. Oh, okay. So sorry. I think did I not see something before, like when you were looking at the current owner and the previous owners, when it actually went to the database and did like am I completely?
Nothing
I
of
misunderstood.
It is lazy loaded. Everything is auto included by default. So all of this stuff here is all in there already.
I see. So all of these are just in memory operations.
Yes.
For data that is previously been loaded. Yeah. Okay. So sorry. So then that was my bad. And then there's nothing that I don't like here. I mean, I will say like there's again, just because my theme here is a little bit of trade-offs. Like basically what you're saying is I'm going to always load everything.
Yeah.
So that everything is in memory and I don't need to have this complexity, right? Which itself has a price. That means that you're right, like just performance-wise, it means that you are probably ending up loading stuff from the database that you won't necessarily need in that particular call site, and that means you don't have to mess around with did I load it, did I not load it, and all that kind of difficult stuff, which is really difficult, like when you're actually working with EF, right? But again, there's always this sort of trade-off. If you didn't go with the always loading auto include kind of approach, then you would have to worry about these things, and you would maybe not even be able to have properties like this. Right, which kind of look right.
And my problem with that is also that to be able to make that work nicely without just turning on lazy loading and actually managing myself with the lazy loader or whatever it means that I need to put persistence logic in my domain objects, which I really, really, really dislike.
So this is exactly where it gets interesting, right? Like we specifically, so we actually discourage the lazy loading in general. One of the reasons, by the way, we discourage lazy loading is precisely because it's synchronous only. Because lazy loading works with properties, right? It's basically a property-based idea. That means that it performs synchronous IO to the database, which basically in 2025 nobody should be doing anymore in a new let's call it a new greenfield application. I'm not talking about if you guys have legacy, but if you're building a new application today, you should treat synchronous IO as something that basically no longer exists, like for real. Otherwise, you're opening yourself up to various problems. So then lazy loading kind of goes out of the window because of this. And indeed, you have to start really working on how you're going to manage the eager or explicit loading of related entities without messing up your division between business logic, data, and all that kind of stuff. That's actually hard. I completely agree.
I'd like to do another talk at some point about that, because we're doing it right now where we are doing it in entity framework agnostic way where we have interfaces on our entities and basically have an interceptor that picks up. So if you want to get your children, but you want to lazy load them, we actually have an interface that an interceptor picks up, injects a lambda that is able to call the DB context to load things for us on demand without it being actually tied to entity framework.
So that sounds like a form of lazy loading.
Yes, it is lazy loading, but it would be completely agnostic of it being entity framework. It doesn't use anything specific from entity framework. It's all interface instead.
All right, interesting.
Kind of nice.
Definitely interesting.
Anyway, interceptors are cool. I don't have anything with those in the presentation, but I think interceptors with entity framework is one of the things that have opened up my eyes to a gazillion things you can do that I really love. So more of that stuff. Anyway, I'm definitely running out of time. Once I've got my address thing and my personal thing in here, I need one more migration. So I need a migration to add my addresses. So I'm going to do an address migration in here as well. And it's going to be, actually, I think I have this. No, I don't. I need to write this myself. EF migration is going to be 002. Address migration. Demo context like that. And then we do one single migration thing in here. I'm going to add an addresses table in here. And then that's it. So it's just an addresses table with the type is current and a few things like that. And then for down, as I said, I generally don't implement it, but we have a drop in here as well, which is kind of nice. Now, if I go back to demo context and I want to keep mapping things in here, that is possible. But as you can see, the on-model creating tends to get really, really big if you keep mapping everything in here and you have more than a minor amount of entities. So what you can do instead is that we can go in here and add a new class. And the cool thing is I can keep this class in my own subdomain. So it's not for everyone. It will still be mapped for everyone, but it's going to be in its own subdomain. So I'm going to have a person type configuration. And it's going to look something like this. So it basically allows me to pull out the configuration for a specific entity from the on-model creating into its own class. I do my mapping in here. So I map my person to the people table. I map a private field in this case, because it's a lowercase ID in my convention. I map the addresses with auto include. I have a complex property called name. I'm going to get back to that in a second, because it's going to cause some problems. And then I'm going to ignore the delivery and invoice address because those are computed columns that I need.
By the way, if I remember correctly, computed columns are, because they're get-only properties, EF ignores by default. I might be misremembering.
Yes, you are misremembering, because I thought so as well, but they actually do not ignore it. It does throw an exception if you don't ignore them.
Really? Okay. Yes. Wow.
At least it did last time I tried, because I was 100% sure of the same thing that you just said, that they are
Very
ignored.
Interesting.
But I do believe that last time we can try it later on. I can try removing the ignore so we can see what happens. But
awesome.
Let's do that next time, or after I've done the rest of the
demo. Yeah, of course.
Then I have an address type configuration. There's nothing complex in here, but it is a bit more interesting than the demo person configuration. So the thing that's interesting here is that I do a shadow property called type, and then I do a discriminator on that. So basically the type column, it defaults to the column name type. Then it looks at the type and it says, hey, if that column contains the string delivery address, then map it to a delivery address. If it contains invoice address, map to invoice address. And then you can, if you want to, if you had a more complex scenario, you can then map those individual addresses to have different types of properties on them as well, which is really, really nice. And yes, these are magic strings, and they could be replaced by, and probably should be replaced by, name of delivery address like that. But to keep it simple, I keep it like that, just so people understand what's happening. So that's kind of nice. And now that they are in different files, all I have to do in my on-model creating is I need to say model builder dot apply configuration from assembly, and then get type dot assembly like that, and it will apply those for me automatically, and it finds it through reflection or something like that, and it applies them. The only thing to remember is that the order of how they're applied is unknown to me, and sometimes order actually makes a difference when you do your mappings, I have figured out. So it doesn't work 100% all the time, but I still like that idea of being able to put it into different areas. Now, this should be it. So let's go ahead and test it. And the way that I want to show you that this actually works is that I have a couple of tests here. So I have some tests in here that tests all of my code, basically runs tests all over my every service that I have, every service call I have. And it basically executes a test by trying something, and then it verifies that it sets up a database, it prepares it by adding things to a database, then runs the test to verify that it comes out, and then rolls back the database changes afterwards using a transaction, but it allows me to verify that everything works as it should. And if we open up the test explorer and we build the project, hopefully this thing will now find all of my tests. Waiting for build to complete. Come on, build succeeded. There it is. It finds my tests, and we run our tests like this. So I have the same tests are implemented. So all the code is available on GitHub if you want to have a look at it. All the tests are implemented in the same way for all the different versions, the raw version, the wrapper version, and the domain version that I'm doing now. And it failed. And the reason I bring this up is because the error message here is really funky. It says, no suitable constructor was found for entity type person.name, #name. The following constructors had parameters that could not be bound to property type first name. Okay. What is actually happening in here is that when I'm mapping my, let's see, in my, where am I going? I'm going up here to domain, data, demo context. In here, in my person class, when I do my complex property here, I think the reason, what we need to do is we need to do this. We need to tell it that, hey, my complex property, and then map my properties to the column names. And the reason for this is I believe that the convention for complex property is that the column name is name of type underscore name of property or something like that. So it expects there to be a column called name underscore first name and name underscore last name or something. But if you fix it, yes?
I don't think this. Yeah, I don't think this error is about what's the name of columns or not, because it's an error that happens way before we even get to the database. It's basically saying it can't find the correct constructor on the name type. I mean, I don't have the context here of what type is actually name.
No, so
you're saying that this
name is a very simple. It's this.
Is a record, right?
And the thing is, as soon as you set the column names for it, telling it that, hey, this property has this column name and this property has this column name, it actually finds that constructor.
Can you remove the actual column name just for fun?
I can. I need to do this in one more place while I remember it, because I did the same thing inside of here. I just need to do that. We can leave one of them. That's that one that I want. So let's leave one and see if it has the same issue. I really hope it does.
This would be weird in any case for me, like regardless, but the has column name would be even weirder.
That doesn't work. Actually, let's see, because there's another exception that happens now. Yeah, no, so it does work. If I do this, it works.
Right.
But I need to have this thing in place. I don't apparently need to tell it the column names. It does figure that out.
That is probably a result of you using records here. Like if this were just a class with to getter to autoprops, this would probably work. That's basically probably what's happening here.
But this works. It's a valid workaround. It's just a very weird error message for, hey, you need to do this, which kind of annoys me. And then then it says the next error is cannot use table people for entity type person since it's being used for entity type person and potentially other entity types, blah, blah, blah. This is table splitting failing. It's because of I have my person here being mapped to the people table, and I have my person in my person type configuration being mapped to the same table. So what you need to do is you need to tell Entity Framework that they're both kind of connected with the same ID. And the syntax for that and I am sorry to say with entity people, framework people on the team, this syntax here is really odd. It might make sense if you understand entity framework internally, but you say, hey, this person here has one of the other type of person with one and a foreign key on it, and then magically entity framework knows that they're mapping to the same table. Would love a shorter, sweeter syntax for that. That made sense, but yeah.
Yeah, this is, I think pretty obviously, not against you. It's like it's a hack. Like this is not like an intentional official way of achieving what you want to achieve here. Like obviously.
I've actually considered starting a small NuGet package project with extension methods that made some of the mapping things easier to do in entity framework, but let's not go there. Now you can see that pretty much all of it goes through. Actually, this doesn't go through. Why did that not go through? No. So this, I know where it is. It was because you asked me to remove that.
Right. That's a different, now we actually have mismatches in the name of the column in the database. That now makes sense.
To that thing there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Works. So the only thing that doesn't work now is it says, hey, wait, I wanted expected actual value 1, which is, and the actual value that I got back is -1. And this is from getting get person by ID. And I happen to know what the issue here is, which is what we talked about previously about hiding the ID. So if we go look at the DTO in here for, DTO extensions here, you can see that I have hard-coded -1 in here when I convert my person to a DTO. And the reason for that is that person has a private field. And I can't access that private field for obvious reasons. And the lazy version of fixing that is you go in here and you make that field public, which is what I tried to get away with to begin with. So instead, I actually like doing it like this. I create a little interface called I have ID of T. And then we move that to a separate file, like that. On my class, I implement I have ID of int. And then I implement that explicitly. And by implementing it explicitly down here, like that, it means that in my DTO extensions, if you ever have a person object, you will never see an ID property on it. But if you do know that it implements I have ID of int, you will then get access to the ID so that in those weird cases when you actually need it, you can get access to it. But what did I do now that made this fail? I have ID. Did I?
I'm parentheses.
I'm missing one. Yeah.
This allows me to access it in emergencies without it being exposed all over my code base, which I really, really like. And if we run the test now, just to show that it works, you can see that all of my tests should go green now. To me, it's just, I like the way of having it object-oriented and encapsulation and hiding as much as stuff as possible so that people who are using my code don't do mistakes because it's hard to use my code. So basically the end goal here is that you map your object, you map to objects that look the way that you want them to look. So I always start out by writing my entities and my objects in the way that I want them to look. Then I start mapping them with Entity Framework, and then sometimes I have to bow to the will of Entity Framework to make it workable, like having the internal person object in the owner object and things like that. But most of the time, I actually get away with having the object that I want, and whenever I don't, I hide it in a private way so that the person using my code gets to work with it in the way that I intended it to be worked with. Using aggregates and auto-include or owned entities allows us to basically skip lazy loading in a nice way without having to do .include for everything. But it also means, I know that there's a performance cost of it, but I'd rather have that performance cost, at least initially, and know that my object is fully instantiated and created than saying like, oh, this property here that you're trying to access, that is only populated if you get it from this specific repository method. Otherwise, we don't load it for you, which makes the code really unusable. I'd rather have usable, readable code and then backtrack on that once you start getting actual performance problems, because honestly, SQL Server can handle a lot of load.
On that, I'll just say, of course, you're right, and most applications out there are not going to be having performance problems because they just don't have that much load that they need to take care of.
Yep.
So it doesn't matter. And in most cases, like I'm a real perf person, but in most cases it really doesn't matter. But I will say this: it is worth, like, this sort of decision. It's hard to backtrack on. Like, if you've designed your entire thing, like your entire code base around the idea that everything is always like your graph is basically loaded, like your bounded graph, then going back from this is quite hard, like to redesign your system and go away. So I would basically just recommend spending a little bit of time upfront, just making sure what kind of perf we're looking at. Is it does it make sense? Does it not make sense? I'll also say another like kind of non-orthodox maybe comment here. If you are going for always loading your entire aggregate root, let's call it like this, or whatever, if you've decided this is the way to go, it might actually make sense to not even model it with relational tables at all. Like, right? At that point, you could just say, sure, that's actually a JSON document on my table, right? And I'm just going to get it like the nice thing about modeling it like a document rather than like in the relational way is that you get it for free. You basically always get the JSON table out, and we deserialize it for you. You don't even really know the difference, but you're not paying all the performance price of all the joins all the time. Because I will say, because of Cartesian explosion and all of these, these relational performance issues, if everything that you do, like if you have one auto include like what you showed here, it's probably completely fine. If you start to have a lot of auto includes at the same level, that's basically how Cartesian explosion happens. Like at the breadth kind of includes. This can get out of hand super quickly. I'm just saying, like, to be very, very careful with this, like with upfront making this decision. But it all depends on your application, the projected load, what kind of data model you have. Is it going to be big? How much data is going to be in there? Because even if you have a lot of joins, but the data is very sparse, that's also not a problem. So it's really, really very, very hard to make this sort of decision making in a general way.
Yep. I completely agree with that. But also, the way that you can kind of backtrack from this, if you wanted to, is that you could remove all of the auto include and then specifically include the things that you need in those specific queries. I have seen that with clients that model the database in that way and then have include here and include there. And it's like you start using a class, and it's like, this is null all of a sudden. Oh, yeah, you called the wrong repository method. We don't populate it there, which causes a bunch of problems. And like you said,
absolutely.
Yes, there are definitely scenarios where load is a problem, but a lot of us do work on like internal applications and things like that, where the load is honestly quite minimal.
Absolutely.
Which then brings us to this thing here about read specific queries. So if you do not want to read out the whole thing for all the time, then having those custom queries for your reads might be a good idea. And as I said, CQRS is something that might be worth having a look at as well if you have a lot of load. Split queries is nice because you can configure Entity Framework to split your queries instead of doing joins, which I think solves a bit of the problem with the auto include, I guess. And I turn that on by default all the time, basically. I also want to say that I prefer using directional navigation instead of bidirectional. I don't like the idea of having blog pointing to blog post and blog post pointing to blog. I always do it in a direction because it tells a story. You're supposed to go from blog to blog post. You're not supposed to go the other way around. According to DDD, the whole idea of having directional navigation actually makes a lot of sense.
That works very well if you're very if you're really looking at it as an aggregate, which is a DDD kind of thing. But in some cases, obviously there's other kind of modeling schools of thought there where you're basically just looking for posts and you don't care about the blogs. And then maybe you're starting from the posts and going back to their blogs, like depending on. In your UI, for example, you might be showing a blog or you might be showing a post. And in both of those pages, you want to show something from the other thing, right? Like
in that case, I would probably map it as two different entities and use table splitting and be able to have like a directional for that specific scenario. But I'm very DDD, right? I'm very much about the way that I would look at it from. So yeah, the valid points, definitely.
Yep, absolutely.
Then there's one thing that I really dislike about all the demos for Entity Framework. I do not like it when you map both the ID property and the entity in your relationships, because to me it's very weird that you set it up and you set an entity and you call like you say blog and blog post. If you save a blog post, you create a blog post and you set the ID of the blog, and then you have mapped both the ID and the blog, and you call save changes async. then all of a sudden your blog is populated on your thing because the ID was set. I prefer having an actual mapped object or mapped entity instead of the ID in most cases, unless I specifically query and use the ID. But that's me. I don't like mapping both ID and entity. That's my opinion. Once again, very DDD focused, I guess. And then my final comment is, can we stop migrating our database as part of our application startup? So I know that I love the migration support built into Entity Framework. We use it a lot. We do migrate our database, but we only do it if during local development. So we have if is debug turned on for all scenarios. I know people who do it in production as well, but one thing to remember is that if you start up your application and you have multiple replicas and they run and start up in parallel, you actually do end up forking potentially a bunch of your replicas because they're going to try to do the migration at the same time and they are going to fail. And if they fail as your program CS, your actual application fails and you might end up with just one running replica because the other ones failed their startup.
On
now,
this,
yes.
Yeah, on this, I'll just say, or you wanna? Yeah, I mean, we are a little bit out of time. I think maybe for an additional demo. I mean, it is an hour 30.
I can just show you. It looks like this. If you want to do it, you can actually do .NET EF. All you need to do is either call this command and you get your migration SQL, and then you can run that from your pipeline, which is a good solution. But if you've ever tried running SQL from a deployment pipeline, you know how much pain that is. So this new feature of the bundle is really nice because it gives you an exe that you can execute. And all you do is you run the exe with the connection string and it runs your migrations for you. I love that as a DevOps person because running SQL files in a pipeline is actually really, really complicated and annoying.
It's not even just the fact that it's complicated. There's also problems with SQL scripts around error handling and retrying, and it's really not great, to be completely honest. But I will mention one thing. For years, since EF Core, basically since EF exists, we've been telling users don't run migrations at startup. Run them as part of your deployment pipeline. Right? You're deploying a new application. That is the point where you're supposed to be applying your migrations. That's the correct thing, and we are still saying that. Like that's generally our advice. However, at some point, you know, when you're like working in a team like EF, you look at your users and you see that everybody is doing it all the time, no matter what you say. People don't really care or listen, and it's just so easy and simple to just say migrate in the beginning. And to be completely honest, it does work in most cases. Like you have just one server, it's not going to compete and so on. So what we did do in EF Core 9, this is fresh, is we do actually have a database locking feature now around migrations.
Wow.
Which means that now, when you start running your migrations programmatically, we take a lock on the database, and if another instance of your application tries to do that, it will wait. It will basically so basically we sort of have fixed this problem. This is still not the recommended way. Like this is an incredibly complicated area. Like this stuff of doing the locking across the types of databases and all that. It's an endless. It's really very painful for us to work with. But we did the thing. Like that's one of the main features of EF9 around migration. So it's a bit less horrible in 9 than it was before. But I absolutely still am going to repeat what you just said. Our advice for any real thing, any real application that's not like just a toy, is basically do it in deployment and not in startup.
I completely agree. The only thing to remember that I'm not going to show because we're out of time is when you do that, you need to have a design time context factory implemented as well to make sure that it actually runs your migrations for you when you do the bundle thing, unless you're inside. If you put your DB context in a class library, you need to have a design time context factory implemented, which is really, really simple to do. But then it allows you to create the SQL file or the bundle for you automatically.
Yep.
I am really sorry that I went over, but all the code is available at that little QR code down there. Do not use the code at link. If you do, make sure that it's all lowercase because Bitly is actually case sensitive and my font only has uppercase, so it doesn't really work. But the QR code works.
One last comment. I just did a test program, and it seems to me that EF Core does ignore read-only properties. Like if there's no setter, EF seems like that I just did a thing in 2 seconds. So at least that's what. So you can maybe simplify your demo just to remove those ignoring in that case. But double check me.
I will have a look at it because I think I did try removing them and it failed, but that might have been 8 or something. I've also updated few version things and so on since I did that.
Sure
test.
thing. I don't think we made a change in that particular behavior, but who knows? Yeah.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank you for listening to me blabber on about EF. Hopefully you learned something from me, and if you didn't learn it from me, you learned some things from the real team that actually know what they're talking about, which I think is good. And I learned some stuff, so that's good as well.
Cool.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. The links and everything will be in our community stand-ups page. So definitely like find it on Google, Bing, DuckDuckGo, or whatever search engine you want. Just type EF Core and community stand-ups and it should be fine. We don't have any questions pending or anything like that. So that's fine. So again, thank you. If people want to see Chris again, maybe talking about the interceptors, which was mentioned, just let us know. We will definitely manage something. And I think that's a wrap for today. Anything from you, Shai?
Nope. It was a pleasure. It's really nice. This is, I will say, like my personal tendency is not to use these sorts of patterns. That's just a matter of taste and style. So I'm really the very, very keep it simple kind of guy, and not only introduce complexity as it's needed and stuff like that, and avoid layers and avoid. But I fully recognize this is not like a correct way. It's just a personal matter of taste of how you want to engineer. So it's really instructive for me to actually see this sort of thing, which is not the way that I personally usually will write an application. But then on the other hand, it also must be said, we're like a developer like me, we work on framework stuff like actual EF Core and .NET and things like this. I almost never use EF as an application developer, as a consumer. It's really, really weird to say this, and therefore this sort of thing is incredibly helpful and important for us to actually see. And a few years back, I had a weird project where I suddenly had to do an EF Core application as a user for an actual super urgent business case, and suddenly I found myself using EF and completely appreciating it in a completely different way, getting very angry at certain things, getting very pleased with certain things. It was super weird because I work on the other side of it. So this sort of presentation is extremely interesting for me. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.